Welcome, I'm Darren, and I'll be your guide today as I look at the early modern NBA cards from 1948 all the way through 1970-71. And I want to specify the early NBA cards because just after this, we started to see NBA and ABA cards both showing up in card sets. And so this looks at the time before we had both of those leagues really showing up in cards. So it gives me a good bookend stretch to look at. But the key to this is the fact that there's a lot of empty space in this history of cards. I'm only going to be looking at 5 card sets because in terms of traditional professional card sets, there are only 3 prior to the 1970s period for Topps. And so I'm going to be looking at all 3 of those card sets, and then I'm going to be looking at the beginning of the 1970s, the mid period of early modern cards. And so that's what this is all about. And the problem with cards for basketball during this period is the fact that basketball was the other sport. That's just the nature of how it worked. In America, we've had 3 sports that are the American sports. Hockey is a hybrid. It's a regional sport that is as much Canadian as it is northern U.S. And so hockey is kind of tucked over in the corner, and where it's at, it is passionately followed. But most of the U.S. has never cared about hockey until fairly recently. So hockey was never a part of the national conversation of sports and thus of cards, but where it was very popular. Basketball, however, has stood alongside baseball and football as one of the great American sports, but it played a very particular role. So with baseball, that is the American equivalent of soccer. That is what sports is. That's just the way that we look at it. And professional baseball is built around that. It is the best of all of our athletes. That's just the way we've looked at it till the 1980s or 90s. Football, on the other hand, is where the U.S. looked at soccer and said, well, it's boring. And we figured out how to make it interesting. And so football fulfilled that role, but it also, for pop culture, fulfilled a role built more around colleges. So colleges didn't really have much in terms of baseball, but football was the sport for college. So baseball was the sport for America. Football was the sport for colleges. And at high school level, well, that was basketball. Basketball was a newer sport compared to the others, but it was a sport that was easily accessible and it was easily confined to a particular space. Everything about basketball just works really well to work with a general audience. And so when you look at pop culture in the mid-20th century, baseball was always that ethereal land of gods. It was the world. It was like heaven. That's the way people thought of it. It was just on a whole nother platform. And then with football was considered something that was tied in, like I said, with college. All you need to do is look at It's a Wonderful Life. And in that, Harry goes away to college and he's all America. He comes back and he doesn't become a pro football player. No, he goes into his job, and it's a low-paying job with a good future. Because for America in that time, when you looked at football, football was what you did in college. And some people would be pro players, but for the most part, it was just a phase of college. And it was in the mid-20th century when we started to actually pay attention to professional football. That was emerging, but that was kind of the way we saw it. Basketball, you look at mid-20th century movies, basketball, that was what the kids in high school played. The football players were like the jocks. And so you'd hear about the football players, but all the heroes were on the basketball team. They were playing on the basketball team. That's the way America saw it. So the great sport in America, baseball. The great sport for college was football. The great sport for your kids was basketball. So that meant for card collecting, you didn't have heroes in basketball. That's just kind of the way that it was. People didn't really pay attention to professional basketball. Now, the NBA in the mid-20th century was similar to the NHL, similar number of teams, but again, in the NHL, it was so passionately followed where people cared. Basketball didn't have that advantage. So when World War II ended and we kicked back off with sports cards, there'd been almost nothing prior to the war for basketball cards at all. Very little for football, but there was some stuff here and there for football, just nothing at a very professional level. Baseball, of course, was all over the place. Hockey had a fair amount of success, and then boxing. So after World War II, when cards were getting kicked back into the American conscience, obviously it started off with baseball, and football was now making a strong presence in this post-war era because America was in a different space. Basketball didn't have much of a role. So in 1948, there were two card sets that were created. Leaf made card sets for football and then for baseball, as far as the traditional four sports go. And then Bowman, which was a card company that already existed making baseball cards before the war. Post-war, they started off making baseball cards and then football cards, and then they rounded out 1948 by making a basketball card set because, well, look, we're making football and we're making baseball both. Let's go ahead and make basketball and just make all three of the sports that the continental U.S. really cares about. And the cards were done in the same way as the regular cards or the cards for the other two sports. They were a smallish card, a little bit narrower than a normal card, and almost square. And the front was just a picture, just a photograph. That was it. Black and white, thin band around the outside, except by the time they got to the basketball set, now they were starting to colorize. Leaf had already made colored cards, and so now they were adding color to these Bowman cards, so basketball kicked off Bowman's color phase. And the back was pretty basic. It had a little write-up about the player, it had some stats, and it had an advertisement, because at that time, that wasn't all that unusual to have an ad on the back of the card. And so that was what they created for basketball. Now, in 1949, Bowman would continue, 50, 51, 52. Those cards would keep getting better. But unfortunately, in 1948, there were not enough basketball card fans to keep it going, so Bowman didn't bother to make a second set. It was a one and done. So over the years, as cards got a lot better, Leaf was only there for 1948-49, so Bowman was the card company into the 1950s. But a young upstart company popped onto the scene with a Napoleon complex called Topps. And Topps wanted to rule the world. So they, in the early to mid 50s, started going head to head. They were at war with Bowman. And by 1956, Bowman finally just said, you know what, screw it. You want it, we'll sell it to you. So Topps bought Bowman. And now Topps was able to take baseball, which is what they wanted, consolidate it so that it was only Topps, but they also inherited football, so they were now making baseball cards and they were making football cards. They weren't yet into hockey, but because they had those two sports, nobody was doing basketball, they decided to celebrate in 1957 by making a basketball set. So 57 was an important year for Topps because since they consolidated everything just to their company, they took the oversized card size of Topps and the oversized of Bowman, both of which were different, and they instead created a whole different size between the two that was unlike either one, but it was now what we consider to this day to be the standard size card. That was a 1957 development. So by the time that the 1957-58 Topps basketball card was released, it was with that dimension, which means that setting aside Bowman, every single basketball card would be the normal standard size. Except as we're going to see, that wasn't the case. But it did mean that for basketball cards, they missed that whole mid-50s oversized card era. So right off the bat, the 1957-58 Topps basketball card was designed with kind of a bit of a spirit of the old Bowman cards, simply because it was an entire image with just a thin band around the outside and virtually nothing else on the front of the card. But while a lot of these cards were portraits, some of these were actually action shots. So using all that real estate and just cramming as much picture on there was perfect in those cases. Because basketball is a very, very visual sport. It's one where the pictures translate very well onto cards, just the action, the way that the action reads, which meant that for this 1957 set that Topps created, it was really built well to celebrate the full potential the basketball had. Again, in those cases where they used action shots. But the card was so unadorned that all they had was a couple of boxes, or I guess I should say trapezoids, that had a very late 50s, 1960s feel to it. I mean, it really does date the card, but it dates it in a really good way. This is a card design that actually holds up extremely well over the decades. It does not look new. It looks old, but it looks like a cool old card. That's how it reads. But on the card back, they actually had some fun. So the overall design is almost Fleer-like. It's pretty basic. But they did have fun with the fact that with basketball, it's the land of giants. And so height is a big deal. And they put a whole side, basically a ruler on the side with a picture of a guy in order to show the height, which was a fun game that they played on these cards that just looks so cool and so much fun. This was a card that they were taking advantage of the opportunity of a brand new frontier, and they were going all out to make these cards awesome. Unfortunately, there was not an audience that was receptive to it, so Topps, even though they wanted to have a monopoly across all sports, they just didn't consider basketball to be worth the effort. So this was a one and done, they moved on, and so it just sat there for the next couple of years while another upstart popped into the scene, a card company called Fleer. And Fleer kicked off their 1959 presence with a Ted Williams set because Ted Williams was no longer a baseball player, he was retired. That meant that they could go ahead and put together a novelty set of his. But then as they tried to venture into baseball, they found that, well, Topps had an iron grip on baseball, and there was no way Fleer was getting in. But Fleer did discover in 1960, a gift from heaven as it were, a whole new football league called the AFL, and this AFL was very well built and it was unusually good and very popular. So now Fleer was able to bypass the Topps monopoly on the NFL and have its own space where they were making professional football cards. This was so great that in 1961, hey, why don't we go ahead and make some basketball cards because nobody's making those. So Fleer did make a 1961-62 Fleer basketball card that is very Fleer, very boxy. It has an almost square picture. It's a normal size card, standard size card, an almost square picture down at the bottom for the player, and then a colored box at the top with the logo for the team, and then a no man's land in between for the player name. And on the back, this is a very simplistic Fleer-like card back, and there wasn't really much of excitement about this card. It was nowhere near looking like a shadow of or influenced by the 1957 Topps set. But there was one thing about the Fleer set that was really cool, which is that they had a subset or a theme that they added, so that for some players they had a second card that was what we would consider an in-action card. This had a really good action shot, and it was showcasing a player. Unfortunately, for poor Gene Shue, you can see that that didn't necessarily mean that they were complimenting the player with the shot, but it added a different dynamic to this card set where, among other things, you had additional cards to collect of individual players. So these cards were becoming more fun. Unfortunately, there still wasn't an audience to really care about it. So as we headed into the mid-1960s, we'd had 3 different card sets from 3 different card companies, and nothing landed. That said, Topps still really wanted to have a monopoly, and by the end of the 60s, they had found themselves in a very interesting spot where the AFL had now merged with the NFL, which meant that everything in football had now once again fallen into Topps' lap. But also Parkhurst was no longer in competition, which meant that now Topps was the card company for hockey, the card company for football, and the card company for baseball. Hey, if you're going to have a monopoly, you got to go all in. So they decided we're going to make this basketball card thing work. But on top of that, the NBA had grown quite a bit. The sheer dominance of the Celtics in the decades prior was now coming to an end. The Lakers had a really interesting presence in the hobby, in the sport, that was a very dominant element. But you also had some up-and-coming teams and some exciting players that was making the NBA more interesting universally. It wasn't quite at the level of being able to compete with the big boys. I mean, we would have the 1970s ABA mess go on because of how the NBA couldn't quite get their hands around making the sport truly exciting. But by the end of the 60s, the NBA was finally in a position where collecting cards could actually be considered a viability. So Topps, now trying to really anchor the entire monopoly that they were going to have on sports cards, it was time to go all in on basketball. And they had to earn an audience. As we saw, there wasn't an audience there. They had to earn it, so they had to do something special. And in order to do that, they decided to dust off possibly the most distinct card ever, the Tallboy. Now, the Tallboy was created in 1965 by Topps to kind of distinguish themselves apart from Parkhurst in hockey. Then they, in 1966, used it in football to distinguish themselves from Philadelphia. So they were using the Tallboys to be very interesting cards to really kind of get collectors to remember Topps. But they didn't use it more than just once at a time. So they had this card that was sitting there, but it didn't really have much of a value. But it was so distinctive that, hey, you put that in basketball, people are going to notice the basketball packs. So in 1969-70, that's what they used. They used the Tallboy. And the card that they created is an all-time classic card. Again, it's not a card that looks modern to us now, but it still holds up as a great-looking card. And the card is an oval in the middle for a portrait of the player. They have some filigree around the four corners, which is just little sketches of players. And you have a name at the top, and you have the team name down at the bottom. Now, here's the thing about Tallboys. Tallboys are oversized cards, but not entirely oversized. They're actually a normal card width, but they're about a third again as tall. So that's what they are. They're normal cards that are just taller, which is perfect for basketball because basketball is a vertical sport with, again, it's the land of giants. So this is an opportunity to really take advantage of the real estate. And ironically, this is the card design that they went with to use all that real estate. But still, it's a really, really nice looking card. And again, very, very dynamic. Now, the card set did not have the interest of having a subset, but it was a much larger set, which meant that there were more players in the card set to really get collectors to have something to pursue and have more players to interest them. So it was a really good card design, the way the set was designed, the way the card was designed, and the way that the card was conceptualized. Even though these cards are awkward to work with, at the end of the day, you're just trying to get people to notice these packs and to buy them. But Topps was doing something in the 1960s where they were adding inserts because, look, over in hockey they had Parkhurst, they had Fleer, and they had Philadelphia in football and Fleer in baseball. They had a lot of competition, so through the 1960s, Topps was putting a lot of inserts into packs. So by the time that this set came up, they were still doing inserts, and so for this set, they had an insert of rulers. Like with the 1957 set, where they had the ruler scale with the picture of the player, or picture of a player, here they did a special insert with a strip of paper that was designed like a very inaccurate ruler that has an artistic presentation of one of the player that pertains to that particular ruler, showing roughly how tall he was. And it's a totally awkward thing because you can't do anything with it in a modern sense. But look, if it's 1969, you're a kid, you got walls, you got, put something up on it. So this insert was accompanied the card set, and the rulers are even numbered. So you can actually try to pursue completing this set. It's designed to work that way. And so that was the 1969-70 set. That was how Topps kicked off its second era of making basketball cards. Now, it was successful enough that they justified making the next set. And fortunately for us, they continued to use the Tallboy in 1970. Now, this set is more of an homage to what they'd done in the mid-60s. Bright color background behind a portrait of the player, but now the portrait is a lot larger because they're using the real estate to allow the height to allow you to get really in close to the players. So instead of using action shots, which you would assume, they're at least using the real estate in a useful way. But the cards are not subtle at all. And the card design has one really interesting feature where they have a basketball down at the bottom, which is where they have the player name. It does help you to really know what sport it is, but it's a replacement to where in the mid-60s they had the team name up at the top, Well, now they had this basketball that was the theme element on the card, which is a very 1970s thing because you go big or you just go big. And that is what they did. But still, it's a fun card design. But this is a set that was built with subsets, and they kicked the card set off with league leaders. Now, they established a standard that they would use for the next few years, which is they have 3 different players on each league leader card. And since this is the second card set of this new era, you've really got to introduce people to the sport. And this is a great way of doing it by giving a couple of players who are league leaders. Now, this isn't any different than what they were doing in baseball, because they were doing something similar in baseball. But still, in 1970, this was still pretty fresh. They weren't really doing much in this regard in football. And so it was thinking of this in a complete way and giving you more cards of interesting players. And when you consider the number of players who had rookie cards in 1969, guys like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, this gives us, for the 1970 set, some second-year cards for a whole bunch of really amazing players who also show up on league leader cards. So, fun card set right out of the gate. But they also had a couple other subsets. They had an all-star cards. And so, even though a player had his normal player card, if he was an all-star, he also had an all-star card. These are super garish. The card design is a bright flashing color. But they also had a picture of the player, which was kind of like in a magazine. That's the way that it looked, which is a lot of fun. But with this card, you look on the back and there's a full shot of the player in action. This is a great use of this card design to, they'd done in 1957 on some cards. Well, here we got to see it for all the All-Star cards. These cards are built about showcasing the player, not explaining the player. They already did that on the player card. Here you get to really appreciate the game. But if you like it with the papery card back, we also have another subset, which is of the NBA Finals, and these cards have action shots right on the front. These cards are also kind of themed around individual players because they have the signature of the player in blue print on the front. So these cards do a great job of bringing out the sport on the front, not just on the back. And that is all they did for the set. Well, checklist card, but that's what they did for the set. But they did still have inserts here in 1970, and at this point they were doing posters. So for basketball, now we've got an almost 8 times the size of a normal card poster of each one of these players, numbered just like the rulers in the previous year, but some really big, great action shots of these players. And again, it's the second year that we're back into basketball, which means that this is still very fresh and new for these players. And so it's just a wonderful treat that we get as collectors for having all this stuff. And that was what they did for the second year. So I'm going to cut it off here because starting in 1971-72, we start to get into the ABA. And so the sets start to get a little bit more broad, and also I've been talking for a while. But for the first 5 major card sets of basketball, this is the history of it. A 1948 Bowman set, a 1957 Top set, a 1961 Fleer set, and then we started into the new era with 2 Tallboys sets in 1969 and then again in 1970. Starting in 1971, we would be back to normal cards, and we would never have a true Tallboy in basketball again by Topps, although we would have the Jam Session cards in the 1990s. But setting that aside, this is the era of interesting cards from that really early era of cards for basketball. So I'm going to be looking at as we head through the 1970s, I'm going to be looking at those in separate videos, which will be coming up down the road. So definitely check those out. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, I urge you to do so. And if you're curious about the Tallboys, I have done an entire video just on Tallboys. So you can definitely look that up. Other than that, I really want to thank you for watching.